From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Dan O'Brien will look ahead to the USDA's crop acreage report coming out next week, and he'll remark on wheat prices holding their ground as the Kansas harvest is well underway during Dan's weekly segment on the grain market trends. Also today, K-State's Mike Tokach on making the conversion from corn to wheat in hog rations. He says the economics are very much in favor of making that switch, and Mike goes over several important wheat feeding management considerations for peak production. Today's Kansas Wheat Harvest Report features Sedgwick County Extension Agricultural Agent Jeff Seiler, and K-State's Mary Knapp awaits with the latest Kansas agricultural weather forecast. All that here on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and another edition of Agriculture Today. In the grain markets, all sorts of interesting developments of late, and of course we'll talk those over now as we do every Friday with Research and Extension grain market economist, K-State, Dan O'Brien from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. First thing off, Dan, as we're very much in the throes of wheat harvest here in Kansas, prices are holding up quite well.
Yes, when you look at cash prices out in the country, Colby $5.71, $6.01 Salina, $6 to Topeka, Garden City $5.91, Hutchinson $6.01, Columbus $5.71. Really a surprisingly good basis at these locations, given that harvest has come into the southern border of the state and is moving northward into these areas. So I would say when you stand back and look at the market factors of this, it's interesting that for the week ending June 17th, got that on a report Monday out of the USDA Ag Marketing Service, about 20 million plus bushels of wheat exported out of the U.S. for the week. And we need a pace of about 17.4, 17.5 to meet the USDA's projection. So I guess it's not surprising that when harvest comes and the wheat's available, that we'd see a pickup in exports. So that's a good thing. Overall, for the marketing year, we're about 23, 24% of the way. In this new marketing year, the one starting June 1st, already bought ahead about 23, 24% of the way to the USDA's projection of about 900 million bushels. So interesting. I'm sure other folks on your program will be talking about what we're actually seeing out in the field, Eric, but if you want me to, I could mention some of that.
Sure, absolutely. It's been interesting to watch these reports from various entities, including Kansas Wheat, other sources, as to what's happening as the combines are scooting through the fields now pretty briskly, and it's a mixed bag in many respects, Dan.
Well, that sure seems to be the case. There are reports of some very good yields, a few instances of okay protein levels, but for the most part, a little lower average protein than we'd had in previous years. Dated June 18th out of the U.S. Wheat Associates, which is kind of an overall broad aggregate of these various reports for hard red winter wheat. What we're looking at is to compare to about 11.9% protein. That was the 2020 crop. And the 5-year average is about 11.6%. And given what we're hearing out in the field, it seems that that's not far off of where things are coming from. Yeah. But what's so striking in those daily reports is the variability. There's some places that caught some rains, and they have some outstanding yields. Read one report talking about how continuous wheat had like a 30 bushel average, and wheat following fallow or presumably in some type of other moisture conservation system had double that or more of yield. So a lot of variability. And of course, the protein issue is front and center. I've talked with colleagues up in North Dakota, Frayne Olson, the extension grain marketing specialist up there. And he had indicated that in light of our shortfall in protein, that they also are having some crop production challenges, and they have very spotty rains. His thoughts were that the size of that crop's down about 30%. That's preliminarily. Could end up being worse than that, but it's not a complete wipeout. And one thing about it, with dry weather, what they do get will be higher protein, but it might be shriveled kernels and some quality issues too. So in this big mixed bag of things that we're all throwing together, in trying to assess the wheat market, you've got that. I would add one more thing. Again, earlier in this week, when you do a head-to-head comparison, say in the Garden City area where, again, so many feedlots are there, and look at the relative ratio right now at harvest of corn prices versus wheat prices on a per bushel basis. Well, at Garden City, you were looking at wheat prices of $5.91, corn prices at $7.15. So you have a ratio there on a per bushel basis of wheat being 83% of corn. But if you break it back down to a per pound basis, which someone would be concerned about if they were putting together livestock feed rations, you're looking at ratios in that area of about, wheat about 77%. So looking, again, the Dodge, Garden City area sure seems to be signals of wheat feeding. And we hear those stories anecdotally, word of mouth that's happening. The confirmation will be at the end of this month. Well, even that may trail, because when we get to the June 30th quarterly stocks report, it'll be recording conditions as of June 1. So it'll still be even trailing what we have right in front of us, because the wheat harvest hadn't started yet. So we may not get full confirmation of that other than what we're told and what we see happening in the field. We may not get USDA confirmation of that until we actually get out to the September 30th quarterly stocks report. But as we stand right now, if wheat's being sold directly to feedlots, that's the answer. We'll see how that works out.
As we switch to the row crops, and you mentioned an important milepost in the USDA report coming out on the 30th, this coming Wednesday. Along with that will be the first indication on row crop acreage. And is the market going to be attuned to that, do you think?
I think it'll be very attuned. The expectation is that we'll see something like 93.5 million acres of corn planted. In fact, if we don't get that, if we're lower than that, I would sure think it'd be a bullish number for the grain markets. Tried to do some preliminary calculations on that, and looking at how corn supply-demand balance sheets and prices would be likely be affected for the new crop marketing year starting September 1 if we get first acreage increases as we're expecting, but more so lower yields, like seems to be being signaled in parts of the northern Corn Belt. Well, the Dakotas for sure, but now good chunks of Iowa, parts of Illinois, northern states pretty dry. Again, Minnesota, you name it, just dry conditions. So the USDA in their latest numbers are planned for 179.5 bushels per acre yield. But we've had some pretty rough conditions in areas we just talked about. And if we end up same supply-demand balance sheet numbers, same usage in particular, with, again, lower beginning stocks now. And if you bring that into this marketing year, at 177 bushels per acre, you're still producing about just a little over 15 billion bushels, and you end up with prices 430, 435, ending stocks about 1.4 billion bushels. But there's risk of, say, 174 or 171 bushels per acre, given how dry these conditions are. And if you, let's say you have, again, 2.5% increase in acres, 174 bushels an acre for a yield, not out of the realm of possibility right now. You're down to about 1.1 or 1.2 billion bushel carry out. Stocks to use 8%. And if you just go by what the historic relationships have been at that level, you'd be looking at cash prices of over $6. If you get 171 bushels per acre, then you're below a billion bushels, down closer to 900, and let's just say you're north of 615. That's for sure. And it probably starts with a 7 in front of it. So I think the moral of the story is, if we get those low yields, we'll have rationing. We'll have high prices. We'll ration usage, and it's just a matter of who's most vulnerable. Is it ethanol, livestock feeding, wet corn milling, exports? Not sure, but if we get low yields, I don't think we just dial in the same usage going forward if our production's constrained down to 14.5, 14.8. And now 14.5 or 14.8 with the very small carry-in, that's a tight situation. So if we produce 14.8 or 0.5 billion bushels, remember, we're comparing that against usage of about 14.765. So you would hope we'd have something produced more than we'd be using, or we're going to tighten things up and prices are going to going to be just that much more volatile to the high side.
We'll see what the USDA says in that report. And a quick glimpse here to soybeans, same notation as far as what we might see out of the USDA numbers there?
Yes, we'll be watching to see what the acreage numbers are. We're so focused on corn because that's been planted first and so much is driven off of that. What's happening in the soybean market is that the export attention of the world has been shifted towards those available supplies in South America. I would say it's kind of a quiet headline, but things are so dry again in parts of South America that the Parana River is low enough that they're unable to get their largest ships up into those areas to load soybean exports out. So another supportive factor for Brazil on the one hand and eventually for the United States on the other, as they're having trouble getting soybeans out of those areas because of their own weather problems. So on soybeans, an important thing to think on is that, gosh, all this dryness we're talking about with corn, how can it not carry over and affect soybeans unless we have late rains? And again, corn made in July, soybeans made in August has been our general idea. So it's a ways to go before we dechristen problems with the soybean crop, but it's pretty hot and dry in some of those areas. And if we're at risk on the corn market for corn production this year, eventually, if that persists, it gets soybeans as well.
Lest we forget, weather still rules out there. Dan, thanks for the comments on the markets, and the next Friday we'll get together once more.
Thank you, Eric. Take care.
He is grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, who puts together each week a good set of notes on what's going on in the grain trades, covering what we've discussed today and much more. Have a look at those at agmanager.info. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now on the K-State Radio Network. Well, as we mentioned in the grain market segment with Dan O'Brien just moments ago, the economics are shaking out such that feeding wheat to livestock has appealed to a number of producers, and not only on the cattle side. Hog producers might want to assess that possibility as well now, given the numbers. And so we brought by a swine specialist, K-State Research and Extension, to talk over the prospect of feeding wheat to hogs. Mike Tokach joins us now. Mike, there is some interest, if not a lot of interest in this out there, you say.
That's exactly right, Eric. And the economics on wheat, of course, varies quite a bit across the state of Kansas and as you get outside the state of Kansas, depending on what the local price is for corn relative to wheat. You know, we always tell producers that once wheat gets anywhere under about 110% of the price of corn on a bushel weight basis, you definitely want to start looking at it for potential inclusion in the diets. And obviously there's some other things you got to take into account, but that 110% is usually what I use as the barometer. And as I looked at prices recently, we're under 100% of the price of corn in almost everywhere in Kansas today.
For instance, Mike, as you have surveyed the state, if you will, and put together some comparative numbers on pricing, what are you finding out here?
Well, certainly as the producers out there that are certainly raising wheat or buying corn and wheat for their pigs, they'll know these prices better than I do on a daily basis. But the prices that we're seeing in north central Kansas is the wheat is just slightly under the price of corn right now. You get down into the central part of the state, there's about $1 a bushel difference. That wheat is less expensive than corn with the new crop wheat competing with old crop corn. And then you get in the southwest part of Kansas, as the corn price rises, we see there that there's about $1.50 a bushel difference. The other thing that you always want to think about as a producer, if you're raising wheat for your own livestock, you have that offset also with that you are selling the wheat, or in this case, feeding it to your livestock at the price that they're receiving it at the elevator, versus if you're buying grain back, if you're buying corn, usually it's with that markup that has to be charged for the handling of that grain. And so you have a price increase on the corn over what the purchase price is. And so even just on that, if you're ever in a situation where you're looking at selling your wheat and buying corn, you've got an extra anywhere from 15 to 25 cents a bushel that is value towards using your wheat as a feedstuff.
The initiative is there, that's for sure, and the reason for doing so. Let's get into the actual aspects of feeding wheat to hogs. And when you compare wheat to corn, say, as far as nutritional value, how do they match up?
Well, there's some things that wheat certainly brings to the diet that are a little bit shorter in corn. And then there's some aspects of wheat, of course, that give up some to corn. And the advantages on wheat is it's higher in crude protein. And as we know, the crude protein can vary quite a bit. And so the actual value of the wheat will vary with what the crude protein content is. With most of our feed wheat that we end up putting into swine and cattle diets typically runs anywhere from the 10.5 to 12% crude protein is what we normally will see coming in. And the amino acid profile is actually pretty nice, and so it matches up and allows us to take some soybean meal out of the diet, which is also what provides some of that extra value to give it more value than corn on a bushel weight basis. The other thing that comes with wheat that's beneficial for us in most swine diets is the extra phosphorus. We normally have to add monocal and phytase to the diets of pigs, and so that extra phosphorus brings extra value to the wheat, to the diet. On the other side, the biggest downside with wheat is that it's lower in energy than corn. And so we have to think about that we're going to give up some on feed efficiency when we add wheat to the diet. And normally we think of that as being 5 to 8% more feed will be used when we use wheat in the diet and replacing 100% of the corn in the diet.
And so that adjustment upward in wheat usage will compensate for that energy shortfall?
What you end up having to do is you either use more feed or you have to add fat to the diet. Normally, and we would think about adding fat. Right now, fat prices are very high, and so we would actually not add fat to the diet. We would give up just a small amount in growth rate, and we'd give up some on feed efficiency. But with the economics, it's well worth the offset of accepting that poor feed efficiency because of the lower cost.
So nutritionally, it most assuredly will work. But making this conversion and some of the other factors that need to be considered, palatability of wheat, that's no issue?
No, palatability is really pretty good on wheat. Probably the one thing that sometimes you have to think about is that initial switchover. Anytime you change from one grain to another, you can have some initial short-term rejection by pigs and by certain pigs. And where we really worry about that the most is with lactating sows or with nursery pigs. With finishing pigs, it's really not much of an issue in growing pigs. And with that switch over, if you really want to be careful, you can switch them over gradually with doing a quarter or a third of the grain or up to half of the grain before going to 100% wheat. But we know we've done a number of trials over the years, and we can feed 100% wheat replacing corn in the diet without having a fall off in production. And certainly we see around the world a lot of people feed wheat as their primary grain source, and so there certainly isn't any problem with doing that.
That transition, would it be wise just to err on the side of caution to blend, as you're suggesting?
Well, that's certainly something that some producers are going to do, and a lot of producers where they have the capability of handling two ground grain sources, certainly with a grinder mixer, you can do that very easily, but in some feed mill situations, they may not have two ground grain bins to be able to do that. But yes, I think the mixing of the wheat in and doing it, moving yourself into 100% wheat on a gradual basis does make some sense if you can do that. If you can't do that, though, I wouldn't be too overly concerned with switching them over to the wheat, just knowing that you may have to blend by hand a few days for those lactating sows in particular.
Are there any, Mike, extra considerations as far as processing wheat then, in the grind, in the mix?
Yes, and that's a very good point. One we always want to think about with wheat. If we grind wheat too aggressively and too fine, we get flouring that occurs, and that flouring can cause us two main issues. The one is obviously with flowability and just getting it through bulk bins and into the feeders and through the feeders into the pigs. So we want to be careful there. But also, when we have that flouring, it increases our chances of ulcers. And certainly where the value of our pigs today, we don't want to be losing very many of them because of ulcer issues. And so what we want to do with particle size on wheat is really want to target still that 650 to 700 microns is what we talk about. And a real simple way to think about it is we'd like to break a wheat kernel down into about 5 or 6 pieces. And we just don't want to take it down into where we have the what we do sometimes with corn or particularly with milo, where we want to take it to a very fine particle size to try to keep improving the feed efficiency on pigs.
Don't pulverize wheat is the
exactly.
message there. Other concerns considerations here that need to be brought into the picture?
Yeah, the biggest one is that the quality, of course, on wheat. And this isn't any different than what we think about with any of our grains. We were fortunate last year that our corn quality was very, very good all across the United States. And so we know that when we have harvest concerns, we have moisture that happens shortly before harvest, or we have any drought-stressed crops. And obviously with some of our corn crop across the U.S., we're already getting concerned about what that might look like for 2021. But we are hearing some reports of scab in the wheat crop, and so you want to watch for that. Because there's scab doesn't mean we're going to have toxins there, but you do want to be testing and making sure that if you've got a high level of scab present, that there is the opportunity for mycotoxins. And the ones that we're most often concerned with in Kansas is vomitoxin. And if we have that, again, in the diet, blending the wheat in to not be the sole grain source is one way to deal with vomitoxin. We also have some feed additives that we can add with it that, again, it does cost some to put those in, but with the value of wheat, particularly in some of our areas of Kansas, it would still be valuable to use the wheat even if we have to use a mitigant in the diet.
So one can counteract that vomitoxin.
Yes, vomitoxin we can counteract pretty easily with some of the additives we have, as long as it doesn't get to extreme levels. And most of the time with wheat, we're not dealing with the extreme vomitoxin that we sometimes see with corn that's been really drought stressed. And what I mean by extreme levels is final diet levels that are over 1.5 to 2 parts per million of vomitoxin, or so the wheat itself. If we have our wheat that's 1 part per million and under, I wouldn't worry about it at all. If we get in that 1 to 2 parts per million, we want to talk about it. And when we're over 2 parts per million, then we definitely want to discuss blending and mitigating for sure.
Any final thoughts on what producers might contemplate before they take the leap here?
Well, certainly the biggest thing you want to do is work with whoever is formulating your rations, because you don't want to do a pound-for-pound switch with corn, because you give up some of the value of that extra protein. And your pigs will like it if you do pound-for-pound. It's not going to hurt them, but you're giving up some of the opportunity. And so you want to be able to take advantage of, you can use more crystalline lysine as an example, the feed-grade lysine in the diet. You can take out some of the methionine that you may be adding to the diet, and you can certainly take out some of the soybean meal and a little bit of the monocalphosphate. And so there's some of those extra value things that come with making sure that you have a nutritionist involved with that change. And certainly if you have any questions, that's one of our things that we'll certainly help you with that here at Kansas State University. If you want some extra help in terms of reviewing your diets, that's some service that we can provide.
Well, do as Mike offers, take full advantage of the swine nutrition team here at Kansas State University. If you as a hog producer are interested in making the switch from corn to wheat as the primary feedstuff for your swine feeding, and all the ins and outs of making that transition smooth and maintaining that performance of your hogs at the same time, take full advantage of their expertise. Mike, thanks. We appreciate the word.
Thank you, Eric.
Mike Tokach, swine specialist, K-State Research and Extension, with us talking about what it takes to make that changeover to wheat feeding to hogs on this part of agriculture today. This is the K-State Radio Network. Agriculture Today continues on the K-State Radio Network, and it's on now to our wheat harvest report for today. Once more, we are traveling around the state via phone and visiting with research and extension agricultural agents in the counties and districts around Kansas. And now we settle on what's going on in Sedgwick County, south central Kansas, as we speak with the agricultural agent there, Jeff Seiler. And Jeff, your producers got off fairly quickly with harvest, somewhat early on, did they not?
Yep, they definitely did. Our harvest got started that first weekend of June 12th and June 13th. Our very first fields came out. By the middle of that week, June 16th, everyone was going, and they were going strong. The harvest was going rapidly until about Monday the 21st, and we got a little rain, kept them out of the field that day. But later that evening, they got in the field. But, yeah, we've been going good. Should be finishing up here. I would say we're about 95% complete. If we don't get any rain, we should easily be wrapped up by this weekend.
And you say you missed out on the rainfall last night, so this very day may be the final push for your producers.
Yep, we didn't get any rain last night, so there's driving through towns. Yesterday evening, there was not many grain trucks in. I only saw a couple combines, so I'm hoping that we can get finished up before we get rained out.
Well, as this harvest was beginning, what did the prospects for this crop look like in your county?
Well, going into harvest, we felt a lot better than we did back in April. As you know, April was incredibly dry, and then we got lucky with some May rains during that grain filling period, so we felt decent about it. And it's turning up that I would say our yields are probably a little bit above average. We're having definitely some good yields. The numbers I've been hearing are 40 to 80 bushels per acre, and a lot more 50s, 60s, even 70 bushels per acre compared to the 40s. Not many 40s are being said.
Did your test weights hold up even with the heat of the last week or so?
They've been in the lower 60s for the most part. That's 60 to 63, maybe 64 range. I've heard some in the upper 50s, but most of them are right around 60.
As you look at the differences in yields, you mentioned anywhere from 40 to 80 bushels. Did you detect differences in management of the crop that led to that spread?
And I think some of those differences, we had a kind of a wet spring where a lot of our top dressing went on later than we'd have liked to, so that may have had an effect on it. Also, our planting date back in October, we were really dry, so there was some fields that were dusted in, and some guys chose to wait until I think it was 1st of November before we finally got a rain and they could get that in. So I think you're going to see a difference in planting date, and also, as always, just variety differences as well.
Did producers have to deploy fungicides to any great extent?
Yeah, and I think that just with how good our prices were with wheat hovering around $6 a bushel, there was a lot of fungicide that went on this year. So the disease wasn't a huge problem in a lot of fields. I think that if they didn't put it on, that they did see definitely a yield reduction. Another disease that we had out there was wheat streak mosaic virus, which in our part of the state, in south central Kansas, we don't have that every year. You know, fungicide doesn't really do a lot for that. So we did see some yield reductions as a result of some volunteer wheat not being controlled last fall.
And it gets right back to that volunteer. That's the catalyst for wheat streak, and that was the issue at hand, you say.
Yep, you got to break that green bridge. You want to kill that volunteer. You know, even if you're not going back to wheat, you need to do it for your neighbor. It should be killed 2 weeks before you plant any wheat.
Are you seeing producers lining up the planters right after the combines roll and double cropping?
Yeah, yep. I've seen quite a few people out double cropping, so hopefully that goes well for them.
And the crop of choice, soybeans, grain sorghum?
Yeah, yep, soybeans for the most part, and then also a little bit of sorghum as well.
As you visited with producers, they probably have good vibes about this wheat production season.
Yep, everyone seems pretty happy. It's always a good year when you're not hearing those numbers in the 20s and 30s. I haven't heard any of those. One farmer I talked to was a little disappointed just because it wasn't as good as last year, but overall it was still, I would say, an above average year. So a lot of happy guys.
And, of course, higher prices certainly lend to the enthusiasm there.
Yeah, that really helps lift your mood.
Jeff, thanks for the briefing, and here's to your producers tying things off very soon now, hopefully even today. Appreciate your time.
Yep. Thank you, Eric.
Jeff Seiler is the Research and Extension Agricultural Agent based in Sedgwick County. And that is today's wheat harvest update for you on Agriculture Today. Rounding out this segment, here's a quick look at a couple of the lead stories in agricultural news. These courtesy in part of DTN. The U.S. Senate voting 92-8 yesterday to pass legislation that will create a carbon credit certification program at the USDA. The Growing Climate Solutions Act, as it's called, will create a USDA certification program to provide technical assistance for farmers, ranchers, and forest owners to enroll in a carbon credit program. The department will provide guidance to producers on how to qualify for carbon programs, as well as establish protocols for carbon markets. The legislation comes as a growing number of companies have started enrolling farmers in carbon sequestration programs to pay for farming practices that minimize tillage and increase organic matter in the soil. Other programs help producers reduce their inputs, such as fertilizer, to lower a farm's carbon footprint. The bill also includes an advisory committee that the USDA will set up, with producers making up the majority of the members there. The bill also includes $4 million in startup funds for the USDA's program. Now, a companion bill has been introduced in the House, but that chamber has not acted on the legislation. As if to indicate the USDA is up to the task for such a program, the department yesterday announced a $10 million pilot project through the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, to help producers in 10 states implement practices to sequester carbon and to reduce emissions. Farmers and livestock producers in 10 states will be eligible to enroll in that. Kansas is not one of them, nor are the surrounding states of Oklahoma, Colorado, Nebraska, or Missouri. And American agriculture needs a permanent disaster program that can provide aid quicker than the ad hoc aid of recent years. That was a repeated theme at a congressional hearing Wednesday from producers who highlighted the increase in disasters that have hit farmers around the country in recent years. Lawmakers are reviewing the farm safety net as Congress is considering what changes might be necessary leading up to the expectations of a 2023 farm bill. The House Agriculture Subcommittee on General Farm Commodities and Risk Management on Wednesday examined the efficacy of the current farm safety net. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, our regular Friday installment on Kansas agricultural weather. And across the way once more, research and extension climatologist Mary Knapp. And rain did, Mary, finally work its way into the state of Kansas and fairly well dispersed around the state the last day or so.
Right. Well, we should look at the week ending on Tuesday for our drought monitor input. Mm-hmm. And the winner there was the northwest part of the state. They were the only division that was above normal. They averaged over an inch of rain in that division, 160% of normal. They did not see quite so much with our overnight storms, although there were some amounts out there. More of it was along west central Kansas into central Kansas, where there were a number of reporting stations that saw over an inch of rain. The hot spot, if you will, for precipitation was the extreme northeastern part of the state. Hiawatha and Brown County reported over 6 inches of rain for the 24 hours ending at midnight last night, and it didn't completely stop after that. So quite a bit of moisture along the east and northeast parts of the state. The ones that have missed out, both with last week's storms and the overnight storms, have been the central and the southeast part of the state. Couple of hundredths of an inch is all that has been reported so far in that area.
And we should note the accompanying severe conditions as well. We didn't need hail, but we had a few episodes around the state.
Right, and we'll still be assessing how much damage and how widespread that hail event was. Also, worth noting that there was quite a bit of wind along with that, and that can create problems both for the wheat that's yet to be harvested and particularly for the corn that has experienced some rapid growth in the last several weeks. We've got a few areas of corn where they've already started to tassel, but there will be more in the next couple of weeks. And again, some of that rapid development in that can make it vulnerable to those strong winds.
And we also have more moisture in the forecast, which we'll get into. But as we check the latest drought monitor, and that takes us up to midweek again, how important was it that we see some rainfall here?
It was very, very important. We've got a lot of corn, soybeans, sorghum that's just beginning to come up. There have been problems reported where there's not been enough moisture to activate herbicides. So having some moisture, even if it's not enough to erase the drought, has been very, very welcome. On the drought monitor, there was some expansion of the abnormally dry conditions. We'd been about 95, 96% drought-free. That dropped to about 80%, but we have not seen any movement into the moderate or severe drought category. It's been more an expansion of the abnormally dry conditions. What might develop in the next week will be highly dependent on whether or not the forecasted rain actually materializes in the south central and southeast. those are two areas that are extremely vulnerable for expansion of drought, and we may actually see some moderate drought develop if the rains don't arrive.
So, more directly, what does that outlook tell us about expected rainfall? The system that's in place now is not done, is it?
No, we have another chance for rain going into the overnight hours into Saturday. As we look down the road, there are chances that pop up a couple of times next week. If we look further out into it, the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day both favor wetter than normal conditions. It's also worth noting that those wetter than normal conditions are really highlighted to our south. The desert Southwest has been baking under very warm conditions and very dry conditions. This is the beginning of their monsoon season, and if that develops and as forecasted, that will also favor increased chances of some of that moisture making its way northward into our southern counties, again, areas that could use some rains.
So what is the extent of moisture we're anticipating? What amounts are forecast?
Well, the quantitative precip forecast for the next week favors as much as 4 to 5 inches in southeastern Kansas, a little bit less as you move into central Kansas, and northwest, west central is going to be more on the range of 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Keep in mind that's the area that saw moisture both last night and last week, so they could handle a dry week for a change.
And presumably temperatures will moderate with these rain events, and that would be beneficial for a whole variety of reasons.
Right. We're looking at high temperatures being more in the lower 90s to upper 80s rather than breaking the century mark. We've got corn that will be moving into the tasseling phase, and having those cooler temperatures will be very welcome for that. And it's not going to be just that the high temperatures are going to be lower. We're also looking at maybe it backing off a little bit on the nighttime temperatures. That's going to be of a concern because with the rainfall, the humidity levels are going to rise, dew points are going to be higher, and those overnight temperatures are likely to stay warmer than is comfortable. That will be of concern particularly to livestock operations. There's already been a number of reports of losses in cattle due to the heat stress. We need to be cautious that you don't get fooled by not hitting the 100-degree mark. If you're at 86 and the heat index is 99 to 100, it will still be stressful to that livestock.
And that is a good reminder that the Mesonet website here at K-State does provide that Animal Comfort Index page, which can keep producers very much up to speed on that stress.
Right. You can find that under our agricultural tab from the main page. There's also the feature where you can chart for the previous week conditions, because as we well know, it's not just today's conditions that impacted, but it's the cumulative stress effect that can really start to cause problems.
If you livestock producers haven't employed that yet, or at least checked it out, do so. The Animal Comfort Index, mesonet.ksu.edu. Mary, we'll get together once again next Friday. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp of K-State. Our time's away once more. Thanks for being along with us, and do enjoy your weekend. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.